Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell, and my special guest with us this afternoon is the Reverend Dr. John McClean. John, the wearer of many hats, Vice Principal of Christ College, also the convener of the Federal Church and Nation Committee, and also a functioning elder at Springwood Presbyterian Church. G'day, John. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Mark. Good to be here. Yep, thanks.
So, John, we're talking about the very important issue of religious freedom. And I can't help but think, but since 2017, so much has changed with the redefinition of marriage. How much do you think that pivotal decision has affected religious freedom in our country?
Right. Yeah. Things have changed. I guess like lots of these things, it's not as if it went from zero to everything just at that point. But I think lots of us at the time were concerned that the redefinition of marriage would lead to further restrictions on freedom of religion, and that's certainly the way it's turned out to be. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so any of my comments on technical issues of law take with a grain of salt. But I think by and large, it's not that the change of definition of marriage, automatically changed issues at law, but more that it was really symbolic of a, continuing shift in our culture, a growing and continually growing gap between Christian sexual ethics and what's now seen as very much mainstream accepted, ethics in the Australian culture, which is that marriage between a man and a man or a woman and a woman should be recognised as real marriage. And so it became a basis on which Christians who didn't agree with that could be accused of, or I don't think it actually really is, but could, it gave an apparent basis for saying, look, you're just being hypocritical, and we as a nation, or not hypocritical, you're just being prejudiced, discriminatory. We as a nation have decided these kind of relationships are okay, and if you say anything critical of them, then you're being discriminatory and unfair and hurting people. Yeah, and I think lots of Christians who were concerned about the change were flagging that would come. There was lots of reassurances that it wouldn't, but it seems to have become a stronger pattern since 2017.
Yeah, I know the Church and Nation Committee put out a very important paper at the 2023 GAOA on gender and sexuality. I'll get to that in just a moment, but just before the redefinition of marriage, we had a case down here. I know you were very familiar with Campbell Markham and David G. That was before we had the non-binding voluntary postal survey on marriage.
Yep.
But even since then, there's been Israel Folau and in particular Andrew Thorburn. Why do you think those cases, or how do you think those cases play into the issue of religious freedom?
So, I mean, the two obviously really high-profile ones have been Israel Folau and Andrew Thorburn. And really interesting, isn't it? It's at this intersection between elite sport, corporate interests, Christian convictions, and views about LGBT issues. That's kind of the magic mix that will certainly make things explode in the media. And I think there's significant political and corporate forces that are at play in both those stories, as well as just the media's interest that here's people who are very high profile, who are being accused of discrimination or vilification. They're the two cases where the mix has been so heady, and it's just exploded in the newspapers as well as on social media and TV and everything. But I think we need to remember that alongside those big high-profile cases, there's been a bunch of less people who aren't as prominent, who some of them have lost jobs. They've certainly had their professional standing threatened. They've found enrolment at university threatened, access to cafes threatened in some cases. A whole bunch of things that don't make the media, where people have also been denied all sorts of rights because of their expression of religious convictions.
Yeah, I mean, as I just mentioned a little while ago, you put out a very good paper on gender and sexuality. Can you tell us what are some of the most significant findings that the committee resolved through that investigation?
On the gender and sexuality front,
Yeah,
yes. So, I mean, in lots of ways, it was just trying to articulate as clearly as possible what I take it to have been. They're the classic convictions of Christian sexual ethics. Gender ethics is kind of a new issue, or a newish issue compared to sexuality. But to talk about sexuality, I mean, the classic Christian view all the way through the Bible and teaching in almost every church over the last 2 millennia has been sex is for marriage. Marriage is between a man and a woman, and marriage is a lifelong committed relationship. And so that doesn't just say that same-sex relationships aren't marriage and that same-sex sex is wrong. It says all sorts of sexual behavior and sexual relationships that aren't in monogamous heterosexual marriage are outside of God's plan. Now, most people, most Christians through history, if you'd asked them whether that was true, I think would have just recognised it was true, and it would have been uncontroversial. But of course, in our culture today, to say those things is highly controversial and often portrayed as being hateful, discriminatory. So that's on the sexuality issue. And on the gender issue, that is a newer question. Not that there haven't been kind of gender bending identities before, and there is in history, but obviously in the last few years, both for kind of social and philosophical, cultural reasons, and also partly for medical reasons, the possibility of people claiming that they have a gender different to their biological body. Obviously, bodies are biological, different to their bodies, their biological sex. Yeah. Claiming that that's different and even doing things that could change their experienced gender in some way to make it align with what they think their gender is rather than what their body says. That's become a whole new area. Again, I think the Bible's clear that God has made us male and female. He's made us in bodies, and our bodies inform us about who we are. There's not as much, of course, classic Christian teaching on that because it's a kind of new question. So our long statement was really just trying to fill some of that out and talk about what some of the implications of that are for the church. And one of the reasons we thought that was useful to do is that if there are complaints about the church's teaching or practice on these fronts, one defence, it may be, it's hard to know in each case how helpful this is, but to at least be able to say, well, this is the consistently thought out position of our denomination. It's consistent with our historic teaching. And so we'd be saying, well, we haven't just made this up. This is not just a kind of, all of a sudden we've decided we're going to discriminate in these areas, but it's us following what has been the consistent convictions of the Christian faith.
Yeah, I remember Stephen.
It's sad that we have to make those defense, but yeah.
I remember Stephen McAlpine's written a book, The Bad Guys. We were the good guys, but now we're the bad guys. The world has changed dramatically. I also remember, Philip Jensen in the 1990s saying that within his lifetime, Christians would be persecuted in Australia and go to jail, and it would be around the issue of sexual ethics. What do you think is the likelihood of that in the coming years now, John?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's obviously pretty obviously the issue is going to be around sexual ethics, especially if anyone faces jail. I mean, people face complaints on other fronts. At present, again, I'm not a lawyer, but it looks like the likely path to that would be a complaint to some anti-discrimination body or human rights commission, which was then the complaint was upheld and the particular Christian may refuse to make the apologies or make the adjustments that is required by the complaint, by the board or the commission, and that then some of those commissions do seem to have kind of criminal powers. So I don't think that's going to happen very soon, but I mean, I could be wrong, but I think the path there is possible. But I think the bigger immediate issue is, I mean, both the bunch of people who found, problems with work and education and professional registration because of that, because of the pressure, and even more what people often call the chilling effect, the fact that it then just makes almost everybody more careful about what they say. And so is a form of censorship, which really comes from self-censorship, that people just think, well, I need to be careful what I say about my moral convictions, which are rooted in my religious faith.
Yeah, I think the chilling effect is quite chilling, when you think, particularly for Christians who, have a message to tell to the nations, and so we want to go out and spread the good news about Jesus. John, in particular, the gay conversion laws that have come through Victoria, I know there's a big push to introduce these into New South Wales as well as Tasmania, where I currently live. How much do you think these might be, if I can say this provocatively, weaponized by people to suppress Christian preaching and calling on people to change their behaviour and repent?
Right. I mean, I would have thought there's every possibility. Although, as far as I know, there haven't been any complaints brought in Victoria yet. But I figure in lots of ways it's a matter of time. Yeah, and whatever the intention of the legislators was, and I guess there's a range of intentions, different people feed in to this, but, the kind of headline is they're reacting against what were terribly abusive practices in some counselling of people with same-sex attraction, almost none of which happened in churches. Almost all of the really abusive stuff happened in secular practices. But in saying they want to ban that, there's been this massive overreach into, at least in Victoria, potentially prohibiting any interaction with someone that helps them to remain faithful to a Christian sexual ethic. Advice in family discussions, as well as in church ministry or in counselling, all at least seems to be at risk. Now we'll wait and see what happens in New South Wales and exactly what legislation passes there. But certainly the first discussion paper that was put out suggested those risks are just as real in New South Wales.
Well, yeah, I remember you were in the media quite a bit around a particular piece of the legislation, or I guess a resource paper, dealing with schools and what sort of sexual ethic should schools require or even promote amongst their students. I think you used the example of a student that was going to be the school captain. What if they were promiscuous? Do you want to explain a little bit more about that for people that have heard about that but not sure of the reasoning there?
Sure. So this is a different legislative front, although, I mean, I agree they all overlap, and certainly people in Christian education circles are concerned that the anti-conversion legislation might have similar implications. But the case you're talking about is there was a consultation with the Australian Law Reform Commission where they had been tasked by the federal government to review the federal anti-discrimination legislation to set it up so that schools had no right to discriminate in their selection of staff, or only very limited. No right for discrimination in selection of students or enrolment of students, and very limited in terms of staff, but also preserve the rights of religious organisations to maintain their ethos. That was the criteria they were meant to reach. But the discussion paper that came out really leant very heavily on the first two, and it's not just my view. Lots of people, certainly in Christian education, thought this was not giving schools the possibility of maintaining their own distinctive religious or Christian ethos, especially because for Christians, as we were just saying, our sexual and gender ethics are part of our religious faith. So anyway, in the discussion paper itself, one of the examples that the commission gave was that under their proposal, it wouldn't be permissible for a school to deny someone a student leadership role because of their sexual behaviour or sexual orientation. And in the response from the Church and Nation Committee, we were just picking up on their example and seeking to make the point that although most Christian schools don't want to have any discrimination on issues of sexuality in terms of enrolment, of course, Christian schools vary a bit, but by and large, they want to enrol any student who's happy to come where their parents want them to have the religious ethos that's being provided. There'd be some situations where some schools do want say their school captain to be an active and professing Christian. And I think some Christian schools do want that. So under the proposed legislation, if your school said, we expect our captain to be an active Christian, and you had a statement that said we hold to a traditional teaching on sex and gender, then you'd pretty quickly be open to a complaint, even if you never actually, said to someone, "Oh, you're same-sex attracted, so you can't become the school captain." I don't think it's ever about a situation where a school is kind of prying into a student's sexual activity and working out what they are. It's just what you've got on paper that would open you to a complaint.
Right.
And so we were just trying to point out how removing that exemption would genuinely impact a school's capacity to establish a religious ethos, a Christian ethos, in the way that it thought it should.
Yeah, it seems like the issue of religious freedom is probably going to be felt more, would you say, in schools than churches? Or do you think it's going to be felt the pressure to conform to the world equally?
Schools and other institutions that have a bigger public face, and they're providing a service to Christians and non-Christians, are obviously the first.
And also receiving government funding.
Right. Yep. So schools, hospitals, aged care services, those kind of areas are obviously the areas where the pressure is going to come on first. But I don't think we can assume that it won't come to churches more strongly already. You mentioned Campbell Markham's complaint. I think there certainly are schools that have felt that they couldn't continue to lease churches that felt they couldn't continue to lease public school properties for their meetings, either because they just felt that they found that the schools were just making it more and more difficult for them, or that they'd be expected to give some undertaking that they wouldn't say anything that was perceived to be discriminatory.
Yeah, I know of churches that are meeting in schools and they have to sign leases of quote unquote hate speech where, they can't talk about certain topics. Some have even said that they can't talk about marriage at all. Um, I'm just wondering, John, in the United States, they seem to be getting on the front foot here and becoming financially independent of the state. Do you see that as something that might grow and develop here, a financial independent model of schooling?
Of schooling.
Mm,
Um, I mean, the interesting situation is that, obviously our schools are heavily reliant upon government funding, but the other flip side of it is our state governments are heavily reliant on independent
yeah.
schools, including Christian schools, especially Christian schools, and including Catholic schools, to provide education. So I think the disentanglement on both sides would be harder than in the US. But I think definitely something to be thinking about, and schools to be starting to do, some sort of forward planning about how would they respond, how can they be sustainable financially if the criteria for state funding became more restrictive.
Yeah, I think it was in the 1960s that the Roman Catholic Bishop of Goulburn threatened to shut their churches unless they received, oh, sorry,
Schools, yeah, yeah.
schools, yeah, unless they received public funding equal to the state. And he did, I think, for a week. And then the state had to back down and go, no, 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 please keep them open. We can't afford to, school all the children without you. Um, do you think there's a sense, John, in which the churches have become, in the last 50 years, too compliant to the state in this regard, that they wouldn't do something similar today as what they did in the 60s?
I'm really not sure. Both, it's hard to say in terms of, the relationship of the Catholic Church to the state and to what was seen as, I think, largely a Protestant establishment it was probably just such a different situation then. I, I think for Protestant churches, we're probably, whether we're any more or less bold, I think we're probably more wary of the state than Protestant churches would have been in the 1960s. I think most Australian Protestants assumed that we were the majority and we were the establishment, or we had lots of voice in the establishment. I think, the fact that we're having this conversation, lots of people have had similar conversations, just illustrates we're more wary of it. Whether we're more or less courageous, hard to say. I'm not quite sure how to measure that.
So to move from one controversial question to the other, I know the committee that you're the convener of, very good committee, has put out a great statement about religious freedom. I just want to quote you one line. Christ is the head of the church, and the state has no right to intrude on the doctrine, discipline, or worship of the church. One of the most difficult things I think we've had to navigate in the last couple of years is COVID, and government shutting down, locking down whole societies, stopping churches from meeting for worship in New South Wales and Victoria, stopping people from singing. I think in every state at some point or another, everybody had to be masked. Looking back on that whole time, John, what's your reflections on the things that we've learnt coming through that, or could have done better, perhaps?
We being the church, or
Yeah.
we being, yeah. Um, it's interesting how this is just a kind of preliminary observation. I'm just intrigued at how often when I meet people, who I haven't met before, perhaps especially in Christian circles, people do want to this is thinking internationally, people do want to kind of retell their own experience of what it was like during lockdown. Obviously, there's a lot of processing still happening
Yeah.
around the world for people. That was a very strange experience. Yeah, look, I'm certain. I largely took the view that whatever the wisdom or folly of what governments were doing, they were acting within a God-given authority to be concerned about public health. Now I know lots of people, and at the time, almost everybody had their own view about what was or wasn't effective and what would or wouldn't be effective, and that's been relitigated again afterwards. But my view was that they were largely acting within a proper area of authority, and so the church should respect that. So they weren't telling us what we should believe. They were telling us that we couldn't meet to worship, but they weren't saying we couldn't worship. And largely, I know it wasn't entirely consistent, but largely similar restrictions were being put on other groups and activities as well. And so it wasn't as if religious belief or religious activity was particularly being picked out.
Yeah, I think it's really important to affirm the biblical principle of honouring the king, that the government is his servant. The government will ultimately be accountable to God. I guess I'm just really still thinking through myself, and I know that there's extremes in this whole debate, and I think on both sides of those extremes is fear. Um, uh, and I think there was always a greater danger, or the most dangerous part of COVID was division within the body of Christ.
Yeah.
For me as a pastor, that was preeminent, is to keep the body of Christ together through that. I guess I'm just reflecting, particularly on the statement, which I totally agree with, about religious freedom, that the state can't intrude upon worship. Legitimately, what could they? I know this happened in the United States. No church that I'm really aware of did this in Australia. But could the church have actually listened to the state and said, look, we hear what you're saying, but we're still going to sing, for instance. We still think that's intruding upon the worship of the church. We can do that in a way that is loving our neighbour and being considerate. We hear you, but you've overstepped your bounds. Do you think that's a legitimate response?
So I follow the argument. I mean, in the end, my conclusion would be, in areas of public health, it's not legitimate. That is, I think the state, the magistrate, rightly has authority in areas of public health, and we should respect that. But I'm not, that's not to say that the argument you've just sketched is completely wrong. I can see how the argument works, and I've got good friends like you, I think, who would want to argue it was. And our committee provided a report to the General Assembly of Australia when it was considering exactly these questions, and the committee's report was, 70%, 80% in agreement with each other, and then we had two sections, one that was arguing the side you just expressed, one that was arguing the side that I just expressed.
Yeah, look, I know, and I know lots of churches have been really impacted by this. I think it really, and I have to I think we have to talk about this because we're talking about this very nature of things. But what's your thoughts and observations, John, looking back over COVID, and in particular, how it affected people on the issue of vaccination? Mandatory vaccination and freedom of conscience there. What's your thoughts and reflections on that in particular, can I ask?
Right. Well, when mandatory vaccinations were being introduced, or at least being floated, and they did become mandatory, certainly in some areas of work, in some professions, and if you wanted to participate in certain activities. It wasn't just Christians or conservative Christians. There were also human rights lawyers, who would have been fairly progressive on other political questions, who were saying this is a pretty significant human rights issue. Yeah, so I think on that one, not particularly as it applied to churches so much as just as how it was applied generally. I think there were areas where I'd want to be critical of what lots of governments did. And churches got caught up in that, and that made it tough for us as well.
I have to ask you, what would be those areas that you'd be critical of?
Oh, well, where there were that kind of idea of vaccine passport, where entry into a church or into a cafe or other, I can't remember the list of what the activities were, where you had to demonstrate that you were vaccinated, where there was probably not, even on the public health evidence, there was probably not really strong evidence that was particularly protective for people. I mean, these issues are, I could see to some extent why in medical settings the government might have been on a firmer footing to say, no, we're going to insist that medical staff have to be vaccinated. But when it went out to teachers and other professions and then just general public, I think it was problematic. I know it's not the case in every jurisdiction. The relief was that particular provision, at least in New South Wales, really didn't last for very long. That doesn't make it right, but at least it disappeared fairly quickly.
Yeah, I think it took a lot of people by surprise. If I could speak personally, it took me by surprise to work through the right and godly desire to honour the king and submit to governing authorities, which Romans 13, 1 Peter, it's a biblical injunction, and yet a growing statism, a growing state paternalism, that we see the state as the saviour that's going to deliver us from all of our perils. And it was just then starting to think through, okay, how far is too far? If we're going to say that you can't teach in our schools unless you're vaccinated, that was, I think, a very pressing concern for a lot of people, even in our church schools, especially in our church schools. But I know even some churches, unfortunately, said, well, unless you're vaccinated, you can't serve in any ministry. And it really, I think, raised some very important issues. Well, is there a limit? And I was just intrigued by the statement on religious freedom that the Church and Nation Committee put out, because I do think it struck that balance. It's saying, yes, we should submit. Yes, we should obey. Yes, we always pray for the governing authorities. But there is a point. And I know, a colleague of yours, Professor Cam Clousing, he's an American, so he's coming from a different geopolitical, historical setting. But,
yeah,
he looked at us, and he was at church with us in Strathfield, and he'd said, I can't understand you Australians. You just comply, and there's never a question. And it raised for me, when is it legitimate to ask, or to even state, no, we want to honour you, but this is too far. That still, I think, is an ongoing pressing question, I think, for a lot of people. Do you find that yourself?
I mean, obviously, I'm on here because I think the freedom of religion issues are important, and so there is a way. I mean, I think the issues we were talking about earlier in this discussion of teachings on sex and ethics, matters of conscience for medical practitioners about end of life care and protecting the life of vulnerable unborn children, and not wanting to be part of terminating those lives. I think they're the particularly pressing issues at present that occupy me. I mean, I guess even just, the discussion we just had then about the COVID experience highlights the more general issue that any discussion of a freedom is going to have some consideration about restriction of that freedom as well. No society can allow people to have total freedom. There's always protection of life and things like that. So, for instance, to move out of Christian religion. There are some strains of Islam that practice female genital mutilation, and at least would claim that that's a religious activity. I think other Muslims would say it's not really part of Islam, but anyway, people would claim it was a religious activity. But that would be illegal in Australia, and I'm happy and glad that it's illegal in Australia. Again, underage marriage would be another issue where it would be seen as a religious cultural practice, but the Australian legal system and the Australian society has made a judgment about when the appropriate age for people to be able to marry is, and I'm happy that that's applied. So that's a restriction on freedom of religion. You can think of tricky ones. Jehovah's Witnesses who have a conscientious objection to blood transfusions. You might say, well, an adult, and I think this is what the law would say, an adult has got the right to refuse treatment, but a parent doesn't have the right to refuse life-giving treatment to their child, whatever their religious convictions are. Now, I think if we take freedom of religion seriously, then that actually is quite a tricky issue to know exactly how you'd navigate it and where you'd think the boundaries are. So whatever principle you state, there'll still be questions of exactly what are the limits and boundaries, and there'll be debates about that. But that doesn't deny the importance of the issue any more than, obviously a general freedom of speech is something that we treasure, but we also will recognise there's some boundaries on freedom of speech. But the fact that there's got to be some boundaries, we might even contest exactly what the boundaries should be, doesn't mean that freedom of speech doesn't matter.
Yeah, and John, I guess one final question too, and this is where the rubber really hits the road. You're the vice principal of Christ College. You're the convener of the National Church and Nation Committee. You're also an elder at a local church, a teaching elder in your own right. What advice pastorally, would you give to Christians as they face this future where religious freedom is under threat, the chilling effect is real? What word of advice or exhortation would you give?
Right. So, you were asking earlier about whether churches would be courageous or were as courageous as maybe the Catholic diocese, I think it was of Canberra Goulburn back in the 60s. We certainly need to be ready to be courageous, and ministers and Christian leaders like you and I, in one sense need to set the example there, because although we might be more obvious targets, because we're employed by a church, in another sense, we've got more protections. The person who's working in an office in a big corporation or public service or something is more exposed. We need to encourage them to be courageous and be ready to speak up for their convictions when they have to. But I guess at the same time helping them, as we always have to think about what's wise and what's gracious. So I think, and you mentioned Stephen McAlpine, Steve's stuff about helping Christians to be ready for being the bad guys is really important. So that's one area. I think related to that, and hopefully this conversation is part of doing this, just helping people understand what's going on, to see what's changed in culture and law and why that's affecting us, and why living as a Christian in the 2020s in Australia feels different to living in Australia in the 2000s.
That's not that long ago.
No, I know. I know.
It's incredibly different, isn't it?
It is. Yep. I remember just over 10 years ago when the Freedom for Faith organisation was first getting organised to help Christians to think and be proactive on freedom of religion. It did feel like, this was people, really kind of trying to future-proof. This is a long way off, but it's good that Christians are starting to get ready. And the issues just came at us so quickly through the last decade. So
Yeah, I
Um,
can actually remember one of the very first meetings. It was at Christ College, I think, with Paddy, one of the guys that was the leaders. Can you tell us, for those that are listening and are not aware of Freedom of Faith, can you tell us a little bit about what they do?
sure. So Freedom for Faith is a Christian, legal think tank, we might say, um, to present a Christian view of freedom for religion and to advocate for freedom of religion in Australia. So it certainly does the kind of legal thinking, and when governments are thinking about any legislation that has an impact on freedom of religion, Freedom for Faith wants to be able to give really good expert legal input into the government. So it's trying to do things upstream, not be fighting things in the courts or under complaints, but try to help influence the shape of the legislation. So that's a big part of it, but there is some lobbying that it does as well, and trying to help Christians generally to be aware of these issues. So I guess that'd be the other area of, you'd asked about pastoral responses. So there's helping us to be courageous. There's certainly just helping us understand what's going on, and also encouraging churches and Christians to be vigilant on issues of freedom of religion. When legislation is coming through, to contact their local members of parliament and express the fact that they've got these concerns. And those sort of things can feel like, what's the use? Maybe you feel like your MP is not terribly attentive, but it has a cumulative effect, that if enough concerned citizens are doing that, and if an MP gets 10 phone calls or 10 visits from people in their electorate saying, I'm concerned about that, they assume, and rightly, that there's probably thousands of people who are concerned about it if 10 people contact them.
So it's part of our responsibility there, John, particularly in a democratic society, to be more engaged politically in a godly way. I'm not talking about with pitchforks and torches, but would you say we've been of late too passive?
I'm just never quite sure what to make of how to make the historical comparisons, but we certainly need to have an active ministry of citizenship, to see that part of the ministry that we're called to is to be citizens. And I guess, we're saying Australian culture has changed. And so there was a time when Christians largely assumed that there was this kind of quasi or general Christian consensus on lots of social and moral issues that, we didn't think it was exactly what the Bible taught, but there was a pretty big overlap. And so we were probably perhaps a bit complacent on some of those issues. And on those particular issues, I think we probably are less and should be less complacent nowadays. And so on those areas, although it's not just on these areas of sexuality and gender. I mean, I think there's all sorts of areas where Christians should rightly be concerned as citizens, to seek the good of their neighbours, to be advocating for what we think is going to serve the common good. Now, actually, when we get down to policy prescriptions, we might have quite different views amongst Christians of what the right policy is, but that's fine. We still are called as good neighbours in a democracy to participate.
Yeah, and I guess just finally, John, I wonder how much of the Christian life, and we've had it probably too good for a while, is a large part of the Christian life is suffering. Like Paul says, the Apostle Paul, anyone who wants to lead a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Now, that's not that we go out to be offensive or anything like that, but that seems to be the normal Christian life throughout the ages, doesn't it? And is it that we're actually going back to normality? Have we actually lived in an unprecedented time of peace?
Right. Yes. I mean, I remember, again, this is reflecting on how things have changed. 20 years ago, you'd preach on one of those passages that was about persecution, and you kind of scratch your head and think, oh, where will I find an illustration for this? And, I know someone whose friend, swore at them because they said something about Jesus, or, whatever it was. If it was going to be a local illustration, it felt relatively trivial. But that's just not the case now. There are quite shocking examples of people who've, as I say before, lost employment, or had education threatened, or things like that in Australia because of their religious convictions. So, we probably are going back to a more normal situation, more like what the New Testament describes. As a church, we've just been looking through the book of Acts. And of course, that's the pattern in the book of Acts again and again. The apostles in the early church suffer persecution. The other thing I notice is that they often will, where there's an opportunity, will appeal to the Roman authorities to act fairly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a parallel to what we can be doing as citizens, asking, and advocating about the kind of legislation we think would be appropriate.
Yeah, as you're talking, I was just thinking about the letters to the seven churches, and it's interesting how often the Lord Jesus will say, "I just want you to persevere and to be faithful even unto death." And every church in every age has faced this challenge, and it's probably our turn. And so it's a good exhortation to think about and reflect on the things that we've been talking about, and what does it mean to be faithful to Jesus now in the 21st century, in 2023, and in the in the coming years. Well, John, thanks so much for taking the time to speak. It's been great to chat with you. If people want to know more about Freedom for Faith, easy just to Google it.
Yes, I'm sure Googling Freedom for Faith will get you there. Yep.
Okay. And obviously papers on the other issues like religious freedom and gender and sexuality available on the Presbyterian Church of Australia's website?
I hope so.
Okay.
I think we need to pay a bit more attention to getting those papers available. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Bring on the persecution, he says. All right. Well, thanks, John. It's been great to chat with you. Well, this has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you found this episode as edifying and as constructive as I have, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Okay.